The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Salma from CCIQ EcoBiz, and I will be your facilitator for today. Joining us today is Adam Liddy, Senior Analyst from the Queensland Competition Authority. The QCA has released its draft determination so that stakeholders can comment on the QCA's proposed pricing approach and related issues, such as the transitional arrangements, before it takes to its final determination, which is to be released on the 31st of May 2019. Today, Adam is going to discuss the draft determination on the regulated electricity prices, which are to apply from July 1st. But before we start, if you want to ask Adam any questions, you can do so at any time during the webinar using the chat box that appears in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. I will now hand over to Adam to take you through today's presentation.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. My name's Adam. I'm a Senior Analyst with the Queensland Competition Authority, and I'm just here to run you through our draft determination on electricity prices, highlight some of the major issues in there, and to answer any questions you guys have. So, a first note is that our official spokesperson is Flavio, who is our chair. So if you want any quotes to go in the paper or anything like that, please let us know. You can get in contact with us, and we'll be happy to organise that. Okay, so the QCA sets prices under the Electricity Act. The power is actually with the Minister, but he delegates that to us. Now, under the Electricity Act, there are three main things that we have to consider when we're setting prices. The first one is the actual cost of supplying electricity to customers. The second is the effect on competition in the electricity market. And the third are any matters that are required by the Ministers Delegation. Now, the Ministers Delegation for this year is very similar to previous years. It asks that we use a network plus retail approach. Now, what that means is that the network, or the N in this approach, is the price regulated by the Australian Energy Regulator. So that is the price regulated for either Ergon distribution, Energex, or PowerLink. So that's all the networks that everyone uses, and they're regulated by the AER. They approve some final prices, and then we use that as the basis for the tariffs. The second part, which is where our main focus is with retail costs. Now, this includes obviously the purchase of electricity from the wholesale market, as well as things like operating call centres, billing systems, and all the other sort of miscellaneous things that you need to have in place in order to be a retailer. Now, another thing that the Minister asks us to do is to maintain arrangements for what's called transitional or obsolete tariffs. Now, we'll go into a bit more detail with those a little bit later on, but for now, let's just note that that's what he has asked us to do. Now, the other thing we have to do is apply the government's uniform tariff policy. And for residential and small business customers, this essentially is a request to set prices for regional Queensland based on the costs in southeast Queensland. And it also asks us to incorporate a value which reflects the terms and conditions of standard retail contracts. We'll go into that a little bit later, but that's essentially what's in the delegation. Now, why is there a uniform tariff policy? Effectively because the cost of supply in regional Queensland, and that's the dark green box, is higher than in southeast Queensland. That's mainly down to the network costs. In sort of simple terms, for every kilometre of wire that Energex puts out in southeast Queensland, they service around about 20 to 25 customers. In regional Queensland, that number is below 5. So as you can imagine, the network is a lot bigger with a similar number of customers. So on average, it's more expensive. Now, the government wants to try and ensure that regional Queenslanders are not disadvantaged by that. So for small customers, what he does, he establishes a benchmark. So you can see that indicated by the blue arrow. So effectively, he sets the benchmark at the Southeast Queensland price, and that's what the regional notified price is based on. Now, obviously, that's below the cost of the actual supply in regional Queensland. And to make up the difference, the government pays the Ergon Retail a subsidy. Now, that subsidy is around about $465 million in the latest budget. Now, network costs, as we discussed before, these are the costs associated with using the electricity network. Now, to ensure that, for small customers, to ensure that the flat rate tariffs, so that's tariff 11 and tariff 20. So these are the tariffs where you might have a fixed daily charge, but the cost of buying electricity is the same no matter what time of the day or when you use it. So for those ones, we simply use the Energex tariff structure because it's a flat rate structure, and that way you're effectively, the network cost that is paid in Energex is built in to the regional Queensland price. Now, for other types of tariffs, there are also tariffs that involve paying different prices for electricity depending on what time of day or what time of year you're using the electricity, and also by how much electricity you use at once. Now, these are put together so that the networks can send some signals about what impact you're having on using the network. So obviously, if you're using a lot of electricity in the middle of the day when everyone else is using it, you're putting more stress on the network because you've got multiple people. Whereas if you use electricity overnight when very few people are using electricity, you're not having much impact on the network at all. So what the distributors do is introduce different prices. So they'll have a cheaper price overnight because that reflects the fact that you're not putting as much strain on the network, and a more expensive one during the day. Now, the different times for peak load on the networks are different between Southeast Queensland and regional Queensland. Obviously, it's a much different area, so the times vary. So what we do to ensure that the correct network signals are being passed through, we use the Ergon network tariff structure, which includes the times of day and the relativities between peak and off-peak. And what we do is we adjust those network tariffs down so that it's the same price level as Southeast Queensland. So on average, what will happen is the regional Queenslanders will end up paying the same price level as Southeast Queensland, but they still get the signals that the distributors need to pass through in order to try and manage their network. Now, as with previous years, the large customer tariffs are based on Ergon East Zone Transmission Region 1, and that's a very complicated way of saying essentially the eastern seaboard of Ergon. That's where around 90% of large business customers are, and that also means that competition has been growing up there. Where over 40% of customers have now gone to the market and no longer paying notified prices because they got a better deal from a retailer. Now, for energy costs, we use a consultant called Acel Allen to do all our modelling for energy costs. They use a hedging or a market-based approach. And what this means is that what retailers do is rather than buying each minute from the spot market, what they do is they buy their electricity using forward contracts. So they'll go to either a generator or go to the Australian Stock Exchange, and they'll buy a contract to have a certain number of megawatts available to them this time next year, or whichever period they want. That way, they effectively manage the risk of the spot price, which is highly variable. It is literally possible for the spot price to go from minus $1,000 per megawatt to $14,000 a megawatt in the space of half an hour or a couple of hours. Now, obviously, that's extremely volatile and it's very hard to budget. So everyone does all this using forward contracts. They're the same types of forward contracts that farmers might use for their produce and things like that, or for currency trading. Now, we've used market data up until the 15th of February, which is less than 2 weeks from when we released the draft determination. The aim behind that is to try and make sure that the any differences between our draft numbers and our final numbers are minimized. So obviously we're in the middle of summer right now, and that means that the energy costs are sort of a bit higher than usual. So we're just trying to ensure that there's no sort of undue volatility flowing through into the final prices. Now, the good news is that overall energy costs are forecast to fall. For residential and small business, it's around about 11.4%, and for large businesses, it's just under 15.5%. Now, for the remainder of the retail costs, what we've done is we have continued to use the benchmarks from previous years. So a couple of years ago, we did some retail cost estimates, and we've been using these as a benchmark since then. So what we've done is we've adjusted, for the draft determination, we've adjusted the fixed component to account for inflation, so just to maintain them in real terms. And the variable amounts, the variable allocators that we use, they've been kept at the same rates as last year. Now, in accordance with the Ministers Delegation, we've also included a 5% adjustment for standing offers. Now, what this means is that when the QCA sets prices, we estimate costs based on market contracts. Now, most of you will be familiar with market contracts. What they are, they're generally available in Southeast Queensland, and what it means is that you will have significant pay-on-time discounts, or depending on how some consumer advocates look at it, penalties for paying your bill late, which are not present in standing offers. And so it means that the terms and conditions that customers in regional Queensland are paying for electricity under are slightly more favourable than in Southeast Queensland for customers who are on market contracts. Now, the minister suggested that the value of these different terms and conditions was around 5%. We've done some analysis, and while there's no single number you can point at, that does seem like a reasonable amount. So we have accorded with what he included in his cover letter. Now, for large customers, we've maintained headroom at 5%, and this is to encourage competition. As I mentioned before, competition is growing, and things are going very well, so we've maintained that as, again, this is consistent with previous years. Okay, so what does all that add up to? In terms of headline figures, overall, residential customers are forecast to pay $58 or 4.1% less for their electricity usage and service fee. The corresponding number for small business customers is around $180 or 7.2%. Now, for the large business customers, that is the people who are using more than 100 megawatts a year, they're looking at 14 to 14.4% less. Now, the reason why large customers are seeing a larger proportional decrease is mainly because the cost decreases are being driven by energy costs. And energy costs make up a much larger proportion of a bill for large customers. Obviously, they use a lot more electricity than other people. So when the energy comes down, it means that their bills get affected more by that. And for the same reason, small business customers are seeing a bigger decrease than residential because on average, they use a lot more electricity than residential customers. Now, looking at the cost drivers here, this is just a bit of an explanation as to where all the various cost movements are going. If you look on the left, the typical customer would have paid $2,491 under 2018-19 prices. That's the prices that are in place now. You can see from the next column that network costs have come down a small amount. Energy has come down by a significant amount. Overall, the retail costs have come down slightly. And the other costs have also come down slightly. And that's one of the reasons why the other costs have come down is because they're generally a proportion of the energy and network and variable costs. And because they've come down, it means that the other costs also go down. So overall, that gives us a net change of 7.2%. So it brings the bill down to around about $2,311. Now, as I mentioned before, the more electricity you use, the bigger the impact on your bill. So you can see from this chart that essentially it's only very, very small consumption customers that are seeing any increases at all, and even then it's less than 2%. So based on the figures we have from Ergon Retail, around about 90.3% of customers would be better off under these prices compared to last year's. Now, transitional tariffs. For those of you who don't know what a transitional tariff is, back in 2012, the government decided to move towards cost-reflective tariffs. So that's the kind of tariff where we're passing through those price signals I was discussing in the network tariff section earlier. So it's ensuring that those signals are coming through so that the distributors can manage the loads on their network. Now, the problem was that at the time, basically all the tariffs that were in place prior to that didn't reflect the underlying costs. So when we moved to these cost-reflective tariffs, because the structures changed, there are a number of businesses that would have been adversely affected by that. So what the QCA decided to do was maintain some of those tariffs on what's called a transitional basis. So that means that we kept them in place for around about 7 years. That's so that people had time to adjust their businesses to get ready for the transition to the new tariffs. Now, obviously, like there was investments made based on the old tariffs and things like that. So we understood that businesses needed time in order to adapt their businesses to the standard tariffs, which all the other businesses have to operate on. So what we've done is we've maintained the transitional periods as requested by the Minister. That means that customers on tariffs 47 and 48, those tariffs will be available till 2022, and all the other transitional and obsolete tariffs will expire at the end of the coming financial year, so on 30 June 2020. Now, another request by the Minister, which we've agreed with, is that we've reclassified transitional tariffs as obsolete for this final year. What that means is that new customers can't go on them. Now, obviously, what we're concerned about, and also the Minister is concerned about, is that if these tariffs are available to new customers, if someone starts a new business or makes some new investments, they might make them on the basis of tariffs which are going to expire in a few months' time. And obviously that means suboptimal outcomes for people. So we want to make sure that people are actually making decisions based on the tariffs which are going to be around for the long term. Now, approximately 40% of connections are actually better off on standard business tariffs as things stand. So that means that they can move across to a standard business tariff and actually pay less for their electricity than they would have paid otherwise. So one thing that the QCA is definitely encouraging people to do is to talk to Ergon Retail or talk to your retailer and make sure that you aren't one of those people who can save straight away. Because yeah, I mean the best way to pay less for your electricity is actually pay the right price in some cases. So it's definitely worth a phone call to do that. Okay, so the next steps. Submissions are due by 12th of April 2019, and we would certainly welcome any submissions that you guys have got to put in. We take all submissions into account when we put in our final determination. Something else that I would note is that we're not the only people that read those. They all go onto our website, as long as they're not confidential, obviously, and they're read by various governments, you know, the Australian Energy Regulator, ACCC, the distributors, and the government as well. So it's another way of getting a message out there, even if it's not strictly related to what we're doing. We have an online submission form. There's the link on the screen. If you go to our main web page, there's also a link on the right-hand side to put in submissions. The task for the QCA now is we'll consider what everyone says in their submissions, and we'll update the draft estimates with the latest available data for the final determination. Now, that final determination is due to be released by the 31st of May, and given the tight timeframes this year, that's probably the most likely date it will come out. Maybe a little bit earlier, but I wouldn't anticipate it being a great deal earlier than that. So that's all from me. And now we have Salma, who's going to have a talk to you about a program which CCIQ is running called EcoBiz.
Thanks, Adam. Before we talk about EcoBiz, I just wanted to run through some questions that came through on the board here. Are those prices what I'll pay in 2019 and 2020?
No, they're the best indication we can give right now based on the data that's available. So we have to take into account what people put in their submission, so that we might have to change our methodology or make changes to the data we use or something like that, as well as update the data with the latest possible that we can get. I mean, obviously we've used data up till the 15th of February because that's the latest we could use while putting out a draft, but we'll also be using more updated data for that. So I would say the numbers won't be the same as this, but it's a bit hard to predict at this point what they actually will be.
Gotcha. Just another one. Why are transitional tariffs ending?
It's mainly because the transitional tariffs, as I mentioned before, they don't really reflect the costs of supply underneath. An example is Tariff 21 is one of the transitional tariffs. Now that's called a declining block tariff. So what that means is the more electricity you use, the cheaper the electricity gets. Now obviously if we're dealing with a network, where the more electricity you use, the more it costs to provide the network, then that's not a very good price signal to be sending, mainly because it's going in the opposite direction. So the additional costs of customers choosing to use more and more electricity because it's cheaper is going to end up with more costs in the long run. So that's an example. Some of the other ones aren't quite as bad as that, but they also have signals that are not conducive to minimizing costs in the long run. So we allowed for 7 years. That was a position which the government has supported. So that's why they're ending at the end of this year.
I see. So what happens to customers on July 1st, 2020? Is there any advice for customers on these tariffs?
Yeah, so look, the key piece of advice will be to speak to Ergon as soon as possible. Even if you're not going to change over straight away, it's good to know what the future is going to hold. Now, I understand that what's going to happen if you're a small customer, most likely you'll get transferred to Tariff 20, which is the flat rate tariff. The reason being that that is the simplest tariff. They don't have to make any changes to metering or anything like that. I would certainly encourage people to look around at different tariffs as well, because there are tariffs like 22A where they have variable time of use signals. They might be more suitable. If you're a large customer, then you're probably going to move to either 44, 45 or 46, depending on how big a user you are. Again, it's probably best to have a chat with Ergon about that to find out sort of where you might end up and what the impacts on your business might be.
Mm-hmm. And why has there been no reduction to transitional and obsolete tariffs?
Okay, well, mainly because for 60% of customers, these tariffs are actually below the cost of supply. So they're below even the UTP level. So while all customers in regional Queensland receive subsidy in the form of the UTP, are being set at a lower rate than it costs, for obsolete and transitional tariffs, there's an additional subsidy on top of that. So what we're trying to do over time through this transitional period is trying to stop the gap there from getting larger, because it means at the end there's a bigger transition. So obviously what we're trying to do by keeping that tariff flat, so not changing the price at all, the reduction in standard tariffs means that the gap between the transitional and the regular tariffs gets smaller without actually having to increase the transitional tariffs. So that's what we're proposing to do at this point, is to keep things flat so that the gap does close without imposing additional financial pain on customers.
I see. Thanks so much, Adam. And before we wrap up today, I'd just like to talk a little bit about EcoBiz. It's an amazing resource that's offered to Queensland businesses. It's fully subsidized, so 100% free. And essentially the program helps to reduce consumption and energy costs weathered by businesses, with the average energy cost reduction being up to 12%. We also produce a range of resources, including expert advice at a 2-hour on-site consultation, with reporting, identifying no and low cost actions that you can implement to reduce the intensity of resources. It's run by the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland, and it's really to help businesses onboard sustainable practices in their operations. There's also a host of marketing resources that are made available, as well as networking opportunities throughout the year. The solutions are specifically tailored to your business and your operations, so we're really trying to help Queensland businesses implement these beautiful sustainable recommendations that are offered by our coaches. So please get in touch with us today and register for the program on our website. As it's 100% free, there's no risk involved. That's all we have for today. Thank you so much, Adam, for taking the time to present today. I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us today for the session. All registrants will receive a copy of the webinar recording and presentation slides, which you should receive this week. Thanks for joining us today, and on behalf of CCIQ, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.